Before we begin, what you are about to hear is a true story. The details are real, the losses are real, and every name you are about to hear belonged to a human being who mattered. A piece of paper moving on the freeways of Southern California on the night of May 14th, 1983. This paper contains 2 columns and more than 60 entries printed neatly by hand. The officers who found in the trunk of a 40-year-old Randy Kraft's car didn't know what they were looking at. Not yet. This list looked like a guest list, maybe a to-do list, or something administrative. Something a man might keep in the glove compartment without a second thought. Maybe something ordinary. It took investigators years to decode it. It took prosecutors 6 more years to prove what those entries meant inside a courtroom. Some of the entries on the list were never decoded at all. The list had a first entry and a last entry. The first read stable. The last read what you got. And between them, more than 60 names that were no longer people. They were codes, a private record, kept by a man who needed to remember what he had done to each of them. Young men, teenagers, Marines, written down so he wouldn't forget, filed neatly in a trunk while he drove the freeways of Southern California and went to work on Monday morning and came home in the evenings like anyone else. Stable was the first entry, written at the top of the first column, but took investigators months to understand what it meant. When they did, they traced that single word back to a bartender named Wayne DUKETTE, found on Ortega Highway in 1971. They understood something else too, that this list didn't start in 1983. It started more than a decade earlier, which meant the question wasn't just who these entries referred to. The question was how long he had been keeping records. And was this list in the trunk the only record he kept? Southern California in the 1970s ran on freeways. The 5, the 405, the 91, the 55. They connected everything: cities, military bases, beach communities, canyon towns. And at night, along their long-lit shoulders, young men stood with their thumbs out. Hitchhiking was ordinary, a way to get from one place to another when you didn't have a car or couldn't afford gas. A transaction so routine that most people who participated in it never thought twice. Thousands of people did it every week across Orange County and Los Angeles County. Most of them arrived exactly where they were going. Well, most of them, not all. Orange County, in that decade, understood itself as a certain kind of place. Conservative, sunlit, the kind of county where the neighborhoods look safe because they were designed to look that way. Where a man with a steady job and a house on a residential street and a live-in partner registered as a resident rather than a suspect. Where the threat, when it finally made itself known, didn't announce itself. It pulled to the shoulder of the freeway with its hazard lights off and its window rolled down and offered a ride. Between 1971 and 1983, that offer was extended more than 60 times. Not one of the men who accepted it knew what they were getting into. That is not an observation about their judgment. It is an observation about how carefully the offer was made. Just before we move on, drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? Because this case touched every corner of California. Tell me where you are. Then stay with me, because what we are about to uncover about Randy Kraft and the scorecard in his trunk, you have not heard this story told like this before. On the night of May 14th, 1983, a corporal in the United States Marine Corps needed a ride. His name was Lee Gambrel, 25 years old. He had somewhere to be, a party, and he did what young men did on Southern California nights when the distance was manageable and the evening was still early enough to feel like it belonged to him. He stood at the side of the road and waited for someone to stop. And yes, someone did. The officers who pulled that car over at 1 a.m. on Interstate 5 near Mission Viejo saw a figure in the passenger seat, still and quiet under a jacket. Drunk, maybe. Passed out. The collateral consequence of a long Friday night. It was the kind of stop that wraps up in 20 minutes and gets filed before the shift changes. Routine, unremarkable, the 10,000 version of a call that never goes anywhere. Officer Michael Howard approached the passenger side. Empty beer bottles on the floor. Pills scattered beneath the seat. The figure wasn't moving. Howard reached for the jacket, then pulled it back. Lee Gambrel had been strangled. He had been dead for hours before the car was ever pulled over. The party he was trying to reach had ended without him. His body had been sitting in the passenger seat, covered, arranged for the duration of the drive. However long that drive had been before the weaving caught someone's attention. The jacket was still positioned over him carefully. The care in that detail, the deliberate arrangement of it, the way it was placed rather than thrown, stayed with the officers who worked the scene. It was not the carelessness of panic. It was something else. His cousin Max Gambrel, years later, he loved his freedom, and the longer he's in jail, it's the only justice my family has. That is all Max Gambrel asked for. A man staying in a cell. More than 4 decades later, it is still all he has. 14 months earlier and 30 miles inland, a canyon held a different kind of evidence. Silverado Canyon, January 1976. A body found in circumstances that stripped the scene down to fragments. Literally. A vodka bottle, shattered at the location, its pieces spread across an area that took investigators months to fully document. They recovered the fragments. They cataloged them. They rebuilt the bottle the way you rebuild something broken when you understand that the broken thing is the only witness you have. His name was Mark Howard Hall, 22 years old. The forensic evidence at the scene documented cigarette lighter burns on the body. His mouth had been filled with dirt. The reconstructed bottle, reassembled painstakingly from dozens of fragments across months of evidence work, eventually yielded fingerprints. Those prints went into a file. The file went into a cabinet. The cabinet sat in an evidence room for 7 years while Mark Howard Hall remained an unsolved case in a county that had more than a few of those. 7 years. After the arrest on Interstate 5, after the trunk, after the scorecard, investigators ran the prints again. The canyon and the car, connected by broken glass and 7 years of waiting. On the scorecard, Mark Howard Hall appeared as New Year's Eve, 22 years old, reduced to a date he never reached the other side of. The vodka bottle took 7 years to connect him to the man who killed him. For 7 of those years, the man who killed him drove the same freeways, worked the same job, maintained the same list. Then there was EDM, 2 letters and a middle initial. 3rd entry from the top of the 1st column. Whatever internal logic governed the organization of the list, Edward Daniel Moore ranked 3rd in it. 20 years old, a Santa Ana resident. 1972, 3 letters. An initial, a middle initial, a last name initial. The kind of abbreviation a man uses when he is keeping a record for himself and has no interest in making it legible to anyone else. Edward Daniel Moore became EDM. Filed, recorded, accounted for in the way that apparently mattered to the person doing the accounting. How many of the other entries started the same way? As a person with a name and an address, and people who would spend years not knowing what had happened to him before the list made them into initials. How many of those initials are still sitting in the unmatched column? On death row at San Quentin State Prison, Randy Kraft played bridge. His regular partners were Lawrence Bittaker, Douglas Clark, and William Bonin. Between the 4 of them, investigators and prosecutors attributed more than 130 murders across California. They had a regular game. Cards dealt, tricks taken, the comfortable rhythm of men with nowhere to be and nothing ahead of them except more of the same. Hold that image. Because the biography that follows, the saxophone, the college degree, the political campaigns, the respectable career, is going to make him sound, at certain moments, like someone you might have known, like someone unremarkable, like a neighbor. The bridge game is the corrective, is the thing you hold on to when the ordinary details start to accumulate into something that might wrongly read as explanation. Nothing in the biography explains the list. The biography just makes the list harder to understand. Born March 19th, 1945, Long Beach, California. His family moved to Westminster in Orange County when he was 3. By high school, the portrait is almost aggressively ordinary, intelligent, politically engaged, conservative in the way that Orange County conservatives were conservative in that era, organized, active, certain. He campaigned for Nixon in 1960, for Barry Goldwater in 1964. He played saxophone in the school band. His IQ tested at 129. Claremont McKenna College. Economics. Graduation. The unbroken resume of someone building towards something. After college, the United States Air Force. He rose to Airman First Class. Then he disclosed his homosexuality to his superiors, and the military responded with a medical discharge. The standard response of that era, clinical in its indifference. Back in California, he tended gay bars in Long Beach, rebuilt a professional identity, and eventually became a computer analyst at a time when that career barely had a name yet. He was among the earliest figures in American true crime history whose working life ran entirely on early computing systems. His colleagues described him as competent and easy to work with. In 1966, arrested for propositioning an undercover police officer. No charges filed. In 1970, a 13-year-old named Joseph Fancher was abducted and assaulted. Kraft was charged. The charges were dropped. Police had entered his apartment without a warrant, and the evidence was inadmissible under the exclusionary rule. Joseph Fancher was 13 years old. The man who assaulted him walked out of a courtroom on a constitutional procedural ruling and drove home to a house in Huntington Beach. Wayne DUKETTE disappeared the following year. Stable went to the top of the first column. He had a live-in partner through the years of the killings. Colleagues who found nothing unusual about him. Neighbors who, when eventually asked, produced the same description that emerges from every interview with the neighbors of men like this. Quiet, kept to himself, seemed normal enough. Inside the house on the residential street in Huntington Beach, when investigators finally searched it after the arrest, photographs. Not a few. An archive spanning years of documented evidence going back more than a decade. Personal items belonging to victims. Clothing that didn't belong to anyone living in that house. The contents of a private record kept in a private home, accumulating across 12 years. While the men those items had belonged to were listed as missing persons in filing cabinets across multiple jurisdictions. The evidence had been in the house the entire time. No single investigating agency had seen enough of the pattern to connect the cases. Each jurisdiction held a fragment. Orange County had some. Los Angeles County had others. The Marine Corps had 2. Oregon had 6 entries that investigators believed referenced Portland victims. Nobody had the full shape of it until the shape was sitting in an evidence bag on a table in an Orange County Sheriff's Station. What it took was not a breakthrough. It was a traffic stop. The last entry on the scorecard read, "What you got?" No prosecutor ever extracted a satisfying account of what it meant. No court record contains a translation. It sits at the bottom of the second column, after more than 60 other entries, in the same neat handwriting as everything above it. Patient, deliberate, the notation of a man who took his record-keeping seriously. What you got? He wrote it for himself. He was the only audience the list was ever intended for. And whatever he meant by it, whatever accounting of his own crimes that final entry represented, he has declined to explain it for more than 40 years. John William Liras was 17 years old. January 3rd, 1975. Last seen boarding a bus in Long Beach. A high school student with somewhere to be. The way teenagers always have somewhere to be. The way the night always feels longer and more navigable at 17 than it actually is. He boarded a bus. He was going somewhere. He never got there. His body was found the following morning at Sunset Beach. The entry, 2-in-1 hitch, eventually translated to a double murder. Jeffrey Nelson and Roger DeVole, two young men, collapsed into a single entry. A logistical shorthand that captured the circumstance of their deaths the way a man might jot a note about a chore he had completed. Investigators, once they had learned to read the scorecard's internal language, understood what the notation meant. Some nights the car had stopped more than once. Some nights the list recorded more than one name under a single outing. Two names in one line. The arithmetic of the list was its own category of evidence about the man who maintained it. In the spring of 1976, over the course of fewer than 3 months, 4 young men died across Southern California. Oliver Peter Molitor, 13 years old in Manhattan Beach on March 21st. Kenneth Eugene Buchanan, 17 years old in Inglewood on April 7th. Larry Armendariz, 14 years old in Los Angeles, April 19th. Michael Craig McGee, also 13 years old, Redondo Beach, June 11th. For entries over 12 weeks. For families filing missing persons reports into systems that had no mechanism for connecting the cases to each other. No shared database that would have shown investigators looking at one case that 3 others had already happened in adjacent jurisdictions that spring. Each case isolated. Each family alone in the particular silence of not knowing. The man responsible drove to work the following Monday, and the Monday after that, and every Monday for 7 more years. Roger Edward Dickerson was 18 years old, a Marine. The forensic evidence from his case documented bite marks. A specific detail entered into a record that took years to connect to its source. He had enlisted. He had a rank in a unit and a service record. The Marine Corps was eventually notified. Eventually, the Corps lost 2 men to Randy Kraft across 12 years. Roger Dickerson, years before the arrest, on a freeway shoulder in the dark. Lee Gambrel, in a passenger seat on Interstate 5 on the last night of Kraft's freedom. 2 men who had signed up, who wore uniforms, who had the institutional backing of the United States military, and who still ended up as entries on a list in a trunk, waiting for someone to pull a jacket back and understand what they were looking at. The method had a consistent shape across 12 years and multiple jurisdictions. Consistent enough that investigators, once they finally had the thread, could trace its outline backward through a decade of cold cases that had never been connected to each other. The freeways, the hitchhikers, young men moving between cities, between military bases, between wherever they'd been and wherever they were trying to get. A car slowing to the shoulder. A ride offered. Accepted. The last decision a significant number of those men ever made. Drugs and alcohol documented across multiple crime scenes. In toxicology reports, in evidence recovered from vehicles, in the physical circumstances of where and how the bodies were found. Young men who had been offered a drink, or who arrived already having had one, and who became progressively more incapacitated in the passenger seat of a car on a Southern California freeway at night. Bodies found near freeway ramps, in canyons, on roadsides at the edge of whatever county line the car had crossed before stopping. Positioned, left, the disposal pattern itself, a kind of documentation, consistent enough, across 12 years and 24 confirmed victims, to read as a system once you knew what you were looking at. The escalation is visible in the scorecard's own timeline. 1 entry in 1971, more the following year. The pace accelerating through the mid-70s. Multiple entries in single months, at least one occasion documented as a double murder. the list filling steadily across both columns. Investigators came to believe the crimes extended beyond California. 6 scorecard entries believed to reference victims in Portland, Oregon. Authorities in Oregon matched what they could. Some they couldn't. There is also this. An alleged accomplice named Bob Jackson told an author that he had participated in some of the murders alongside Kraft, and that the scorecard represented only the encounters Kraft found memorable, with the true count closer to 100. No charges were ever filed against Jackson. His account has never been corroborated in a courtroom. It exists in the record as a documented allegation, nothing more. But the question it raises has never been answered either. The forensic evidence across the 16 confirmed cases is detailed and was presented across 13 months of trial testimony. What happened between the moment a ride was accepted and the moment a body was found? Those details are in the court record. They do not need rehearsing here. What needs to be said is this. 22 entries on that scorecard have never been matched. 22 entries with no identified victim, no recovered remains, no family who received a phone call. 22 people. The demographics of the confirmed victims make the pattern clear, who exist in the official record only as the open space where an answer should be. He kept the list so he wouldn't forget. 22 entries suggest he remembered things the official record has never been able to verify. 22 families who may still be waiting, who may have been waiting for 50 years, who may not even know what they are waiting for. 22. That number, and the silence behind it, is the part of this case that doesn't close. May 14th, 1983, by 1 a.m., at Interstate 5, Mission Viejo, California. Officer Sterling observed a dark car moving south on the freeway in a pattern that read less like carelessness and more like management. The slow, deliberate drift of a driver whose attention was elsewhere. He ran the plates. He activated his lights. The car pulled to the shoulder. Randy Kraft, 38 years old, stepped out of the vehicle himself, walked to the front of the car without being instructed to, submitted to a field sobriety test with the composure of a man who understood the procedure and had decided, in advance, exactly how he was going to behave during it. He failed it anyway. While Kraft was being processed at the front of the vehicle, Officer Michael Howard moved to the passenger side. A figure in the seat, a jacket laid over him, beer bottles on the floor, pills scattered beneath the seat. The figure was not moving. Howard approached, reached for the jacket, and pulled it back. Terry Lee Gambrel, 25 years old, United States Marine Corps, rank of corporal, strangled, dead for hours. The party he had been hitching toward had ended without him while he sat covered in a passenger seat on Interstate 5. From the shoulder of the freeway, Kraft's documented words. The 4 words he chose, out of everything he could have said, at the moment an officer told him the man in his passenger seat was dead. "How's my friend?" Composed, emotionless. Not the words of a man confronting an unexpected development. The words of someone who had decided what his words would be and said them on schedule. The search of the vehicle produced a scorecard. 2 neatly printed columns. More than 60 entries in handwriting that gave nothing away. The officers on scene preserved it without yet understanding what they were holding. It was, at that moment, an unreadable document in the trunk of a car parked on the shoulder of a freeway at 1 in the morning. The search of Kraft's home in Huntington Beach came next, in the hours and days following the arrest. What investigators found there reframed the stop on Interstate 5 from a DUI with an accompanying homicide into something that had been accumulating in that house for more than a decade. Photographs, an archive, personal items belonging to victims, clothing that had no business being in the house of a man whose partner had never reported anything unusual. Evidence distributed across rooms and drawers and storage, patient and organized. The inventory of 12 years of a second life lived alongside the ordinary one. The evidence had been there the whole time. In the house, in the trunk, on the freeway shoulder in the form of a Marine corporal under a jacket. Investigators from multiple jurisdictions had worked pieces of the pattern. Individual cases, individual missing persons reports, individual crime scenes, without the mechanism to connect them. No shared database, no interagency thread. Each county working its own cases in isolation. What broke, it was not an investigative breakthrough. It was a driver weaving between lanes on the 5 at 1 in the morning and an officer who happened to notice. The question of what would have happened if that officer hadn't noticed is not a comfortable one. The trial began in 1988, 5 years after the arrest. It lasted 13 months. At its conclusion, it was the most expensive criminal trial in Orange County history, a distinction that reflected not just the duration, but the scope of what had to be proven. 16 separate murders, across more than a decade, connected by a coded list that the defense argued meant nothing of the kind. Kraft pleaded not guilty. The defense built its case around reasonable doubt and alternate suspects. William Bonin operated in Southern California during the same period. Patrick Kearney had been convicted of murders with similar victim profiles. The argument was that the evidence connecting Kraft to the scorecard entries was circumstantial, that prosecutors were constructing a narrative rather than proving one, and that the list was exactly what Kraft had always maintained it was. His explanation for the scorecard, entered into the record, a coded guest list for a surprise housewarming party. One column for confirmed guests, one column for maybes. The prosecution had the scorecard cross-referenced against 12 years of missing persons reports, crime scene records, and forensic evidence from cases spread across multiple counties in 2 states. They had the fingerprints lifted from a reconstructed vodka bottle in Silverado Canyon, matched 7 years after Mark Howard Hall's murder to the man now sitting at the defense table. They had the photographs from the house in Huntington Beach, the personal items, the clothing, 16 separate cases, each one documented, each one connected to an entry on the list, presented methodically across 13 months of testimony to a jury that had agreed to give more than a year of their lives to understand what they were looking at. In May 1989, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty, all 16 murder counts, related charges of sodomy and torture. November 29, 1989. Sentencing. Judge McCartan placed his words into the record. I can't imagine doing these things in scientific experiments on a dead person, much less someone alive. Randy Kraft placed his words into the record. I have not murdered anyone, and any reasonable review of the record will show that. Between those two statements, the absolute distance between what one man had just absorbed across 13 months of evidence and what the other man had maintained for 6 years, the entire case exists in miniature. A judge who could not reconcile what the evidence showed with his understanding of what human beings do to each other. A defendant who has never moved from the position he took on the night of Jacket was pulled back on Interstate 5. Kraft was sentenced to death on November 29, 1989. He was remanded to San Quentin State Prison, where the sentence has not been carried out. He is still there, still alive, his death sentence still formally in place, suspended by the accumulated weight of California's moratorium on executions and the legal process that surrounds it. On death row, for a period, he played bridge with Lawrence Bittaker, Douglas Clark, and William Bonin, 4 men for death sentences, more than 130 murders attributed across 4 cases, a regular card game in a state that had decided not to carry out its sentences. The scorecard still has 22 unmatched entries. The man who wrote it is still alive. He has had more than 40 years to explain it. He is not. Wayne Joseph DUKETTE, 30 years old. Ortega Highway in 1971. Edward Daniel Moore, 20 years old. Santa Ana in 1972. Malcolm Eugene Little, 20 years old. Found beside a freeway in 1974. James Dale Reeves, 19 years old. found beside a freeway in 1974. Roger Edward Dickerson, 18 years old, a Marine in 1974. John William Learis, 17 years old, last seen boarding a bus in Long Beach in January 1975. Mark Howard Hall, 22 years old, Silverado Canyon in January 1976. The broken bottle, the 7-year wait, the fingerprints that finally connected the canyon to the car. Oliver Peter Molitor, 13 years old, Manhattan Beach, March 1976. Kenneth Eugene Buchanan, 17 years old, Inglewood, April 1976. Larry Armendariz, 14 years old, Los Angeles, April 1976. Michael Craig McGee, 13 years old, Redondo Beach, June 1976. Jeffrey Nelson, Roger DeVole, 2 names, 1 entry, 2 in 1 hitch. Terry Lee Gambrel, 25 years old, a Marine corporal who needed a ride to a party. Found under a jacket in the passenger seat of a car, stopped on Interstate 5. His cousin still measuring justice by how long the man stays in a cell. 16 names in a court record, 16 verdicts, 16 families who spent years in the specific silence of not knowing, and then had to learn to live in a different silence. The silence of knowing exactly what happened and understanding that the system that produced the verdict could not produce all of the answers. Then there are the 22 entries on a scorecard that no investigator, no prosecutor, no forensic analyst has fully decoded. 22 people. The pattern of the confirmed victims makes the demographics clear enough, who exist in the official record only as the absence where an answer should be. No identified remains, no notification sent, no verdict with a name attached to it, no phone call to a family. The families of the 22, if they are out there, if they are still asking questions, if they were ever given enough information to know what questions to ask, are waiting for a resolution that the official record has never been capable of providing. Randy Kraft is still alive at San Quentin. The scorecard still has entries no one has decoded. The man who wrote those entries has maintained, across 4 decades of incarceration, that he is innocent, that the list is not what prosecutors said it was, that any reasonable review of the record will show that. The record has been reviewed extensively by prosecutors, investigators, journalists, appellate courts, and the families of 16 confirmed victims. The verdicts have held. The 22 entries remain open. The man who could resolve them, who is the only living person who could match a name to every cryptic notation on that list, has declined to do so. The law, as it currently stands, cannot compel him. 16 men have names in a court record. 22 more have nothing but a notation on a list written by the man who put them there. A notation that was decoded by no one, reported to no family, resolved by no court, and explained by no defendant. What do you call justice when the scorecard still has entries nobody has decoded, and the man who wrote them is still alive and has never explained a single one?